The talk today is a little more thematic, like we've had through many of the talks. And we'll be discussing a kind of idea here. And then in several subsequent talks, we'll look at case studies that exemplify how that idea is put into practice. So the talk today is looking at what is the role of the right and the left side of the brain. And it really is talking about two completely different ways of thinking. Now, in M.I.T Csikszentmihalyi's terms, that's sort of convergent thinking and divergent thinking. So convergent thinking is more focused and more literal. Divergent thinking is more expansive. Dan Pink, we're reading a chapter in his book, A Whole New Mind, this week. Dan Pink calls that L-directed thinking. That's parallel to M.I.T Csikszentmihalyi's convergent thinking, or R-directed which is more coincident with Csikszentmihalyi's idea of divergent thinking. So he thinks of L-directed thinking being more direct and more literal, R-directed thinking being more abstract and more broad and global. Now the L and the R there have to do with a link to the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And there's a lot of controversy about that these days. I think in the last maybe decade, there was a lot of interest in this happens on the left side of the brain, this happens on the right side of the brain. And they're very different. And then there was a period of thinking, oh wait, as we know more about neuroscience and there's more fMRIs done, we realize, whoa, it's not quite as simple or as clear as that. But there certainly is something different about what happens on the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And then more recently, there's been a little more evidence that maybe there really is a much more clear differentiation between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain physiologically. We're not going to worry about physiologically how does the left side of the brain or the right side of the brain operate. But what we are interested in is the difference between L-directed thinking or left brain thinking and R-directed thinking or right brain thinking. And that's really what the talk is about today. So in his book, A Whole New Mind, Dan Pink has a subtitle of that on the cover, says, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. So he's really kind of making a pitch for R-directed thinking. He's saying mostly we've been dealing with L-directed thinking, left brain thinking. In the future, it's going to be much more about R-directed thinking or right brain thinking. Now, the history of all this is that Hippocrates actually was one of the first that thought that the left side of the body was superior to the right side of the body. And the reason for that is because it contained the heart. Obviously, inside, we're not symmetrical. And the heart is on the left side of the body. So he said the left side of the body is superior to the right. And then in the 1860s, there was a French neurologist named Paul Broca who discovered that it was in the left side of the brain where the ability to speak occurred. And because the ability to speak is a very intelligence-related kind of thing, a thing human beings do better than other animals, there was a thought that, okay, the left side of the brain where speech is, that's the more sophisticated part of the brain. And then a decade later, this German neurologist, Karl Wernicke, he discovered that also our ability to understand language is on the left side of the brain. So there again, it's not now just about our ability to speak, but our ability to think seemed to be nested on the left side of the brain. So that began an era of really thinking that the left side of the brain makes us human. The right side of the brain is the subordinate or the illiterate or the retarded side of the brain. And for a long time, that was a kind of accepted notion. The superior side of the brain is the left, the right is just kind of along for the ride. And then in the 1950s, an American neurologist named Robert Sperry disproved this. And he said there appear to be two modes of thinking rather separately in the left and right hemispheres, respectively. The so-called subordinate or minor hemisphere, meaning the right side, it is in fact found to be superior when it comes to performing certain tasks. So if it's some tasks, the left side of the brain is better, but there are some very important tasks in the brain that the right side is actually better at performing those. So in general, the left hemisphere is very good about linear reasoning, about thinking through a problem step by step. It excels in analysis, and it handles words and language. That's what happens on the left side of the brain. On the right side of the brain, it reasons much more holistically, not linearly, but holistically. It recognizes patterns, kind of immediately looking at the big picture can see patterns in that. It interprets emotions and nonverbal communication. So if the verbal communication on the left side, the nonverbal communication, which we're understanding more and more, is really essential. It's on the right side of the brain. And it also handles spatial and visual information. There again, spatial and visual information, especially as we get digital devices that give us much more spatial and visual information, this becomes more and more and more important. And that's on the right side of the brain. Now the brain, of course, is contralateral, meaning that your left hand is controlled on the right side of the brain, and your right hand is controlled on the left side of the brain. So there is that in terms of manipulation of actual ability to use fine motor skills and gross motor skills. Also, the left hemisphere is more serial. It's about talking and reading and writing, which are things we do a word at a time and linearly and serially. So the left side of the brain thinks very well serially. The right side of the brain is much more simultaneous. It takes in information in a gross way, in a complete way, and deals with it in a macro sense. So face recognition, it's not that you understand, oh, that's my buddy Joe, by analyzing his eye, and then his nose, and then his mouth, and then his chin. You take in all of that information about the face, and you deal with it simultaneously. And that's something the right side of your brain does very well. Orientation, so it's kind of whether you're spatially aware of your environment, whether you're able to find your way around, that kind of orientation is something done on the right side of the brain. That is not linear. You're taking in lots of visual cues. That building, this tree, that walkway, all that is letting you know where you are and where you want to go. That kind of orientation is on the right side of the brain. Also, image register. So just being able to identify, oh, that's such and such a building. In my architecture and society class. That's happening on the right side of the brain. It's simultaneous. You're seeing many cues all at once. It isn't linear, looking at one thing, then another, then another. So that is all happening on the right side of the brain. The left hemisphere is much more literal. It only registers what's there and deals with it in a very literal way. The right side of the brain is a little slipperier. It reads emotion. It reads nuance. It can deal with things like metaphor, abstract things that are not so literal. So as you can see, there's a kind of different ethos of the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. The left hemisphere analyzes detail. It's very logical. It's very analytical. In some ways, it's computer-like. That's how a computer works. And the right side of the brain sees the big picture. It's seeing rapid, complex synthesis. So the things on the left side of the brain, often that's what we're looking at artificial intelligence doing. It works like a computer works in a linear and analytical way. The right side of the brain is able to do things that are not so easy for a computer to do, in that it's rapid, complex synthesis of many different cues looking at something all at once and simultaneously. The left hemisphere handles convergent thinking, in Csikszentmihalyi's terms, that solving well-defined problems that have one correct answer. So that convergent thinking that is a determinate problem and we're looking for one answer, that's going to happen on the left side of the brain. But the right hemisphere handles divergent thinking, in Csikszentmihalyi's terms, that is the ability to generate a great quantity of ideas and a flexibility to think in multiple ways about a problem. So the right side is more about divergent thinking. The left hemisphere handles logic, sequence, and literalness. The right hemisphere is about synthesis, about emotional expression, about context, and the big picture. Now, this guy, Chris McManus, he wrote a book called Right Hand, Left Hand. He makes a really good point. Let me read a quotation from him. He says, "However tempting it is to talk of right and left hemispheres in isolation, they're actually two half-brains, designed to work together as a smooth, integrated whole in one complete brain. The left hemisphere knows how to handle logic. The right hemisphere knows about the world. Put the two together and one gets a powerful thinking machine. Use either on its own and the results can be bizarre or absurd." So we're meant to use the right and left side together. Dan Pink says in A Whole New Mind, a different chapter than the one you're reading, he says, "Some people seem more comfortable with logical, sequential, computer-like reasoning. They tend to become accountants and engineers. Other people are more comfortable with holistic, intuitive, and nonlinear reasoning. They tend to become inventors, entertainers, and counselors." So some people's brains are better at left hemisphere functions. Some people's brains are better at right hemisphere functions. And Dan Pink is saying that maybe inclines us to different types of thinking and different types of activity because of our brain's capability. Now, I've said before, I'm not wholly on board with people like Dan Pink generalizing about disciplines. I would say there's some engineers that are very left brain engineers, but there are some engineers that have very high functioning right brain capability. And that high functioning right brain capability may be essential for their engineering. So I'm not quite as comfortable about just saying left brain strengths makes you a good engineer. But I get the point that things that are more analytical and more linear and more determinate, that happens on the left side of the brain. Engineers do a lot of that. Those things that are more holistic, maybe tied more to emotion, more about the macro view, those are better on the right side of the brain, and probably entertainers deal more with that. So in a general sense, I very much get Dan Pink's point about different brain strengths orienting us to have our lives and our career in different directions. Now, Dan Pink, as I said in A Whole New Mind, is really saying what we need to be doing at this point in time is thinking much more about R-directed thinking. That we've had, especially in the organizational age, a lot of emphasis on L-directed thinking. But in the future, we're going to need to be better at the right side of our brain. And so our education and our The fact that we have neuroplasticity means that we can alter our brains to be better at one thing or another. So we should be concentrating on honing our skills on the right side of our brain. And his reasoning for that is about the 3 A's. And we talked about this in a very early talk in the semester. Just to refresh your memory, the 3 A's are abundance and Asia and automation. And his point is that we're living in an era of abundance. We may not like to think about that, but honestly, there's never been a period of time in the entire history of the world that we've had more abundance. In the United States for sure, but certainly many countries emerging from substantial poverty to have much more abundance. And in doing that, we're demanding more and more innovation, more invention, more new things. We want new films that are interesting and provocative and lead us in a new direction intellectually. We need new devices that will have new apps and new things they can do and new possibilities. We want video games that are challenging and new and make our brain go in a different way. So we're constantly, because of our abundance, now we're not just worried about food and clothing and shelter. We're interested in things that enhance our lives, and that means innovation, and that means creativity, and that means right brain thinking, invention. So the first A is abundance. The second A is Asia. Pink makes the point that Asian culture in general has been very much about following the rules. Politically, these have often been cultures that had authoritarian governments. And there were many rules, and they were not encouraging people to think for themselves or to express themselves individually, but they have been much more collectivist and rule-bound societies. And he says that works great for left-brain thinking. If you're doing that within that context, that works in the political system and the social and cultural system. But right brain thinking that has more rebellion, that has more individualism, that culturally this is different from what Asia has been in a historical sense. And different than many of the governments, like the government of China right now. So he's saying that Asia is very good at producing left brain thinking, and that their emergence in the world economy has been because they're training people in their rapidly developing universities to do a lot of left brain thinking, to be engineers and to do logical analytical thinking, computer science. These are things that he thinks Asia is going to be really good at. And because their salaries are somewhat lower there, Americans are not going to be able to compete on that kind of yeoman left brain kind of activity. So it's going to put us out of business trying to compete with Asia on left brain thinking, just economically. And then his third A is automation. And he's making the point that, especially with artificial intelligence, the computer is very good at L-oriented thinking. And it can do that logical, analytical, sequential thinking pretty well. So as AI increases, we're going to have more and more people put out of their job because a computer is doing that job very efficiently and more economically. But those things that require a different kind of thinking, a more emotional thinking, a more macro thinking, a more pattern-based thinking rather than linear thinking, that's harder for the computer to do. That's not what a computer is set up to do. And so there's going to be much more room for jobs and careers in R-oriented thinking and careers that look in that way. And automation won't be such a threat. So he says because of these 3 A's, we need to, in an educational system, in an economic system, in America, we need to be looking at more orientation toward our side of our brain thinking, right hemisphere thinking. Now, from my point of view, I think most fields, most creative fields, They're actually a combination of L-directed thinking and R-directed thinking. And for a minute, let's just look at medicine as an example of that. So there are some parts of medicine that are very L-directed thinking. And the last, 6 or 8 years, as an architect, I've been involved in designing the education building for 3 brand new start-from-scratch medical schools. Dell Medical School here, one at Sam Houston State University, and one at University of Houston. So I've been working with medical educators extensively over the last decade. And I'm listening to what they're saying and what they do in medical education. And there is a part of it that is training the left side of your brain. And that's classes in physiology, classes in chemistry that look at how pharmaceuticals chemically interact with the body. Often surgical treatment is very linear, procedural kind of work. There's a lot of medicine that really depends on left side thinking. But then there also are parts of medicine, and I think these newer medical schools are very interested in emphasizing that more than traditional medical education. They're things that are about the right side of the brain. And they're things like diagnostics, which isn't always just linear thinking. You may be looking at a broader pattern here and being able to identify something within a pattern. Narrative medicine, where it's about a story. You're trying to understand that person's background and interests and activities and how that might be interacting with this malady in their body. That's much more emotional. That's more right brain thinking. Certainly psychological context. And we're now knowing that psychiatry, psychology have much more to do with our health than maybe we thought before. That's right brain thinking. And even things like empathy, for a doctor being able to relate to their patients. And you've got to gain your patients' confidence. If you're asking them to go on this regimen to affect their health, they've got to trust you. And establishing that kind of personal relationship and empathy, that's the right side of the brain. So the point is, if you're a doctor, you need to have left brain strengths and you need to have right brain strengths. So at Columbia Medical School, they are addressing more right brain education than they did in the past. They're now very into narrative medicine, where they do diagnostics based on the patient's story. You're really trying to understand, who is this person? What is their life like? What is their lifestyle like? That narrative medicine is now working on the right side of the brain. At Yale Medical School, they've been honing their powers of visual observation. And they require students to go to the Center for British Art at Yale and to study the paintings. So you're analyzing the colors in that painting, the texture of that painting. Because part of medicine is visual. When you're a surgeon and you open up that person's gut and you see that liver in there, is that liver just the right color of pink? Is it a little too yellow? Is that vein pattern just the right texture, or is it a little too dense or a little too sparse? These are visual things, and the visual things come from the right side of the brain. So Yale is training those doctors to be connoisseurs of visual observation by looking at art. At the UCLA Medical School, they're now requiring their students to do overnight stays in the hospital because they want to increase the students' empathy with patients. What is it like to be in that hospital? What is it like to have noise all night long? What is it like to have light on all night long? What is it like to be interrupted 3 times in the middle of the night for medication? What kind of frame of mind does that put you in? You need that kind of empathy. And that empathy, that's happening on the right side of the brain. So more and more medical education is educating not just the left side of the brain, but the right side of the brain as well. And actually, we now know that from social science studies, that patients also, their recovery is not just about medication that you give them to affect the chemistry of their body, or about surgery that you do to mechanically alter the operation of their body. Those are things that are more linear and logical and analytical. But also, a patient's recovery can be dependent on something like the physical environment of the room in the hospital. There's a great study done by a guy named Roger Ulrich, where he took a hospital with a double-loaded corridor, identical rooms on both sides of a corridor. On one side, those rooms looked into a brick wall 20 feet away. On the other side, those rooms looked into a beautiful garden with trees and kids playing. And then they tracked over a long period of time, how did patients recover on one side of the hall versus the other side of the hall. And it's pretty much identical patients in terms of the treatments they were getting, but when they were on the side that had the beautiful view to the courtyard, they required less pain medication than when they didn't have a good view, and their hospital stay was shorter than when they did not get a good view. So the recovery in medicine is not just mechanical, it's psychological. And that's the right side of the brain that we're dealing with in that kind of medical recovery. So medicine is certainly a combination of L-directed thinking and R-directed thinking. The whole field of education is being seen more and more as a combination of R-directed thinking and L-directed thinking. We're not just trying to get people to learn facts and knowledge and so on, but they're much more about kind of narrative imagining. Did you want to stop? No. Okay. So this is going to be a little longer one. I forgot to tell you that in advance. So in the field of education, one of the things they're all over is assessment. And how do you, for instance, in an SAT score, how do you tell, does this person have the potential to move on to college, be very challenged in college? How does the SAT measure their capability for education? And it has historically been very L-directed. But there's this guy at Yale, a psychology professor named Robert Sternberg, who proposed an alternative SAT. And in this SAT, they were asking people to craft humorous captions for cartoons. They were asking them to write a narrative story, tell me a story. They're asking them to face real life challenges and tell me how you would respond to that. So it's much more indeterminate problems instead of those freaking determinate problems on the SAT test. And it's much more emotional and situational. And so they're looking, what really predicts success in college? Is it that left brain analysis of the SAT test, or is it the right brain analysis on the alternative SAT test? And they tracked these kids as they took that alternative SAT test, and their success in college was predicted much better by the alternative SAT than it was by the more left brain traditional SAT test. Now, germane to this class, creative problem solving definitely happens on both sides of the brain. It requires L-directed thinking and R-directed thinking. It requires convergent thinking and divergent thinking. So left brain is about convergent thinking. This is in, again, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's terms. And right brain is about divergent thinking. And we remember those dualities that we looked at. We looked at 10 different dualities that are a part of the personality of creative people. That creative people tend to have these complex personalities. They're both this extreme and that extreme. Often you can categorize those into they're good at this left brain skill and this right brain skill that seem opposite, but in fact they're very complementary. So he says that creative people have both discipline and they're playful. Those seem like opposite things, but discipline is a left brain trait. Playfulness is a right brain trait. He says that creative people are both rooted in reality and they have imagination and fantasy. Reality is a left brain trait. Fantasy is a right brain trait. He says that they're very logical, very analytical, but they're also very emotional. Logical is a left brain trait. Emotional is a right brain trait. Often their creative people are very objective, but at the same time they're very passionate. Objective is a left brain trait. Passionate is a right brain trait. So basically what he was saying is that creative people have these great strengths on both sides of their brain. But one of the things we need to do is, in trying to solve a problem creatively, we need to know what strength we want to be playing to. And if you remember earlier in the semester, I told you about 2 social science studies that illustrate this well. This idea of using your left brain or your right brain. One of them looked at preschool kids who, there's a whole room full of preschool kids, they've got lots of activities they can do. They found the kids who like to draw. And they took those kids and they put them in 3 groups. And in one group, they rewarded them. They said, if you draw a lot, we're going to give you a prize. In another group, they didn't say anything, no prize, no nothing. And in the middle group, they didn't tell them there was going to be any prize, but in the end, if they drew a lot, they got a prize. And then they did that for 3 weeks, and then they sent them back in the big classroom, and they observed. Did it change their behavior? Are they drawing more or less? Drawing being a kind of creative activity. And they found that those students who were not given a prize, they just continued drawing like gangbusters. The kids who didn't know they were going to get a prize, it wasn't contingent, they just kept drawing like gangbusters. But the kids who had the carrot and stick motivation, if you draw, we're going to give you a prize, that moves the activity over to the left side of the brain. Now it becomes a more linear reward I get if I do this action. It's a checkbox activity, and it goes on the left side of the brain. And those kids get thinking about drawing as a left brain activity, and when there's no reward, when they don't get the carrot and stick motivation, they stop drawing. So if you move an activity into the left side of the brain, sometimes it causes it to atrophy in the right side of the brain. Another example, I told you of this second social science study where these were college students and they were given a candle, some matches, and a box of tacks, as you can see on that table right there. And there was a wall that was made out of cork on the left-hand side, and the idea was that you needed to figure out a way to light the candle but not have it drip on the table. And in the first group, they said just solve the problem and have fun. And in the second group, they offered them $5 if they were in the first 25 to get a solution for the problem. So again, they're doing a carrot and stick motivation, and one group has that kind of if-then, logical, analytical motivation. The other group, it's just a game, it's fantasy, it's fun, it's just activity. And it turned out that the second group that got the reward took an average of 3.5 minutes longer to solve the problem than the people who did not have that carrot and stick motivation. And of course, the solution was to not think of the tacks as what you've got here, but to think that there's a box and there's the tacks. And use the box and tack it to the cork wall, put the candle in it, and light it, and then when it drips, it doesn't drip on the table. Most everybody ended up with a solution, but the people who kept it on the right side of the brain and were just having fun with it and were self-motivated did it an average of 3.5 minutes faster. So one thing we have been able to understand is that if you have a real strength of R-directed thinking, it can be super advantageous. Dyslexics tend to be very strong in right brain thinking and not as strong in left brain thinking. Dyslexics have problem with language and reading. Language and reading on the left side of the brain. They have problem with sequential things. So if you're R brain, heavily R brain thinking, you might well be dyslexic. And it turns out that self-made millionaires are 4 times as likely to be dyslexic as the rest of the population. Dyslexics do very, very well in the world often. They make lots of money because of their strength in the right side of their brain. And they generally struggle with L-directed thinking, but then they compensate for it by acquiring extraordinary skills on the right side of the brain. Sally Shaywitz, who's a Yale neuroscientist that specializes in dyslexia, says dyslexics think differently. They're intuitive and excel at problem solving, seeing the big picture and simplifying. But they're very poor reciters, but they're inspired visionaries. So there are fantastic advantages to have a very strong right side of your brain. Aphasics are people who have damage to the left side of the brain and often cannot do any kind of linear sequential problem solving. But it turns out they're excellent lie detectors. They can see in someone's face whether they're lying or not, and they're 70% effective in telling if somebody's lying. Whereas people without that kind of right brain strength, that they've got a balance of left and right, would not be nearly as good at being able to be lie detectors. So the whole point of this discussion is about thinking about how we train, how we use neuroplasticity in the left side of the brain, and how we use it in the right side of the brain, and how we develop skills in the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain, and then how we merge those together to be creative problem solvers. And I think that's something you can use in your project to think, what kind of left brain thinking do I need to be doing here? What kind of right brain thinking do I need to be doing here? And in the class as a whole, this is, I think, a very useful tool for understanding how to be truly successful at creative problem solving. Okay, see you next time.